It began with a sound no one else seemed to hear. Not a bang, not a voice, but something softer, like the hush of wind through long grass, or the distant hum of a lullaby sung in a room you can't quite find. The boy who would one day be known as Jerry Smith never remembered it clearly, and yet it stayed with him, stitched quietly into the fabric of his heart. Jerry was small then, just another child in a world that rarely slowed down to notice softness. He had a round face, an awkward smile, and the kind of eyes that seemed always half lost in daydreams. When he sat by the window, he would stare into the sky for long stretches of time, as though waiting for the clouds themselves to reveal a secret. The adults around him thought he was distracted, lazy, or simply not trying hard enough. But Jerry was not waiting out of idleness. He was listening. Listening for that faint whisper he never understood, yet always felt. In his memory, it seemed to come most often at twilight, when the world softened into shadow. The air would cool, and the street outside his small home would fall into quiet. And there, in that gentle stillness, something in the sky leaned down toward him. He could not put words to it, only that he felt, in those fragile moments, less alone. No one else believed him, of course. Children sometimes speak of invisible friends or strange feelings in the dark, but adults often brush these away with polite laughter. Jerry stopped mentioning it, but inside he carried the knowing, an unshakable sense that he was not forgotten by the universe, that perhaps the universe, in its infinite strangeness, loved him in some small and quiet way. As he grew, he came to treasure little things that others overlooked. A sandwich, made hastily in the kitchen, could feel to him like a banquet. A nap in the afternoon sun felt like a holy ritual. He did not chase greatness, he did not reach for glory. What he sought always was the comfort of being held by something larger than himself, even if he could never explain what that was. There were times, walking home from school, when he would feel the air shift around him. Leaves rustling, a bird darting overhead, the golden spill of light across a sidewalk. All of it seemed to move in quiet conversation with him. He never claimed to understand what it meant. But it was enough to know that even when he felt like a misfit, the world itself seemed to bend a little closer, as if whispering, "You matter, Jerry. Even if no one else sees it, I do." And this was the origin, though he didn't know it then. The beginning of a life that would one day carry him across worlds, through galaxies, through timelines so tangled they might as well have been dreams. Not because he was brilliant, or strong, or clever, but because he was ordinary in a way the multiverse cherished. Rick Sanchez would one day scoff at the idea. Morty would blink in confusion, trying to piece together how someone like Jerry could hold such a place in the fabric of existence. But the whisper had chosen long before they would understand. For now, Jerry was only a boy. He spent evenings lying on the grass in his backyard, staring at the stars as though they were old friends. Sometimes he would hum to himself, tuneless, simple sounds that carried no meaning, but soothed him all the same. And on those nights, if you had listened closely, you might have sworn the stars were humming back. His parents barely noticed. His teachers mistook him for absent-minded. Even his friends sometimes teased him for drifting away into his own thoughts. But Jerry never let it wound him deeply, because the whisper, that faint and faithful presence, would return just when he needed it most, reminding him that even if he stumbled, even if he was unseen, he was not forgotten. There is a strange kind of strength in that, though it rarely looks like strength at all. The power to keep showing up each day, quietly, softly, without demand for recognition. The power to notice beauty where others rush past it. the power to be small and yet deeply loved by something vast. And so Jerry's story began not with invention or with fire or with destiny written in bold letters. It began with a forgotten whisper, a murmur from the fabric of creation itself, folding gently around a boy who would never quite know why the multiverse had chosen to care for him. He would never be the hero of epics. He would never stand tall as conqueror or genius. But one day, across countless dimensions, the truth would surface, that in his ordinariness, Jerry had become extraordinary. That in his softness, he had been seen all along, and for tonight, that is enough. The boy closed his eyes in the fading light, a small smile at the corner of his lips. Somewhere deep in the hush of the evening, the whisper passed once more, softer than breath, shaping the path ahead. There are some memories that stay pressed into a person's life, the way flowers are pressed into the pages of an old book. Jerry's was simple, so simple that most people would have laughed if he'd ever tried to describe it. It was just a sandwich, a plain sandwich, stacked crooked on a paper plate, made on a quiet afternoon when he was still a boy. But in Jerry's world, small things had always carried the weight of eternity. He remembered the kitchen light, too bright, flickering slightly, buzzing the way fluorescent bulbs do when they are just about to fail. He remembered the uneven crust, the bread a little stale, the cheese not melted all the way. He remembered that he sat at the small table, swinging his legs back and forth as if the rhythm alone might keep the universe company. It was then, as he lifted the sandwich in his small hands, that the moment changed. For just a heartbeat, he swore the air shifted, bending toward him. Outside the window, clouds swelled, rolling heavy and white across the sky. And in the stillness, Jerry felt the peculiar certainty that the universe itself had stopped to watch him take that bite. No one else noticed. His parents carried on with their own noise, moving through the house with hurried steps and distracted voices. But for Jerry, it was as if the sandwich itself glowed with a quiet importance. He chewed, slowly, deliberately, as if savoring a ritual he could not name. Later, when he tried to remember it, he realized it wasn't about the food at all. It was about the stillness, about the way the moment folded around him, pressing itself into memory. A sandwich was ordinary. But in that afternoon light, in that soft whisper of air that seemed to lean closer, the ordinary became sacred. He began to dream of it afterward, though the dreams were never exact. Sometimes he would see a sandwich floating above him like a pale moon, drifting across a night sky filled with stars that hummed. Sometimes he would find himself walking across endless fields of bread, each hill rising like a gentle wave, each valley carrying the faint scent of mustard and warmth. The details shifted, but the feeling remained, a sense that something as small as bread and cheese could hold the infinite. Jerry never told anyone. How could he? Children are often dismissed when they try to explain the strange holiness they feel in the ordinary. But inside he carried it with him, this soft conviction that the multiverse was somehow woven into the smallest things. As he grew older, the dream returned in fragments. A bite of food on a stressful day could anchor him, reminding him of that long-ago stillness. A cloud drifting across the sky could pull him back to that kitchen table where the whisper of creation had leaned close and said, "I see you." Rick would have scoffed at such thoughts. To him, the universe was formulas and explosions, choices measured in risk and brilliance. Morty might have listened, confused but earnest, unsure whether to laugh or nod. But Jerry never needed them to understand. It wasn't for them. It wasn't even for him. It was just the way the world had chosen to touch him through sandwiches, clouds, and quiet pauses that others rushed past. And so the sandwich became more than food. It became a motif, a kind of language the universe spoke only to Jerry. Each time he sat down to eat one, he felt the faint tug of that whisper, the hush of the multiverse reminding him that small things mattered, that he mattered. One evening, not long after that first memory, he carried a sandwich outside into the backyard. The sky was deep blue, evening stars flickering awake. Jerry tilted his head back as he chewed, and for a moment he imagined the sandwich rising above him, glowing faintly, a pale and gentle moon. And he smiled, because somehow, impossibly, he felt that the stars smiled back. And there is something quietly heroic about finding wonder in the smallest of things. A sandwich, a cloud, a nap in the sun, these are not the victories most people sing about. Yet, for Jerry, they became the milestones of his life, each one carrying him deeper into a story the universe had been telling since his first breath. Others would chase after galaxies, after trophies, after names written into history. Jerry would chase sandwiches, naps, and half-forgotten whispers of love that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. And though no one would see it, though no one would give speeches about it, the multiverse itself leaned closer each time, cradling his ordinariness like something precious. Time does not always move the way we think it does. For most, it is a steady river, flowing in one direction, carrying people quietly from youth into age. But for Jerry, time sometimes felt different. It bent, it softened, it lingered on the moments others forgot. The first time this became clear, Jerry was still young enough to be invisible in the eyes of the world. Children are often unseen, their small thoughts drowned by louder voices. Yet Jerry's thoughts were the kind that stayed, echoing like footsteps in an empty hall. One evening, he found himself lying on the living room carpet, staring at the ceiling while his family bustled around. His parents were arguing about something he didn't understand. The television blared half-hearted laughter from a sitcom. But for Jerry, everything grew strangely quiet. He noticed the way the dust in the air floated, slow and golden in the lamplight. He noticed the way his own breath seemed louder than the world outside. And then, time stretched. The sound of the television faded into a low hum. His parents' voices slipped into silence, mouths moving without sound. The dust froze mid-air. Even his own heartbeat seemed to pause. And in that silence, Jerry felt it again, the presence, the whisper. It was not frightening, it was tender, as if the universe had pressed a finger gently against the clock of his life and said, "Wait, stay here for just a moment longer." He blinked, and the world returned. The sitcom laughed again. His parents' voices grew sharp. The dust continued its lazy drift. But Jerry lay still, holding on to the softness of that stretch, that pause. He had no words for it, no language to describe how time itself had leaned toward him. But he knew it mattered. Years later, he would wonder if Rick had ever felt such a thing. Those moments when science bent into silence, when formulas dissolved into awe. Rick would never admit it, of course. To him, stretching time was a trick, a machine's job, a manipulation of physics. But Jerry's stretch had no wires, no devices. It was simply given. After that day, Jerry began to notice it more often. Waiting in line at school, he would feel the seconds elongate, carrying him into a place between breaths. Walking home, he would pause to watch a bird land on a branch, and suddenly the moment would expand, lasting far longer than it should have. The world would slow to let him see, let him feel, let him remember. And always there was that same tender hush, as though the universe wanted him to know you don't have to rush. You are not behind. You are exactly where you need to be. It was a gift, though Jerry never thought of it that way. He thought it was simply his own strangeness, his way of being. Teachers grew frustrated when he lingered too long, lost in a moment. Friends teased him for staring at nothing, but Jerry didn't mind, for in those stretches of time he felt something he could never explain, a belonging that had nothing to do with success or approval. There is a quiet kind of power in being able to stretch a moment, to hold it in your hands a little longer than the world expects. Jerry carried that power without knowing it, like a secret pocket in his heart where time slowed just enough to let him breathe. Later, Rick and Morty would stumble into these stretched moments without realizing. They would find themselves standing beside Jerry as he gazed at a sunset longer than anyone should, and they would feel it too, the way the air thickened with softness, the way silence grew wide enough to hold them all. Rick would scoff, Morty would blink in wonder, but Jerry would only smile, as if it had always been this way. The truth was, Jerry had never asked for it. He did not seek wisdom or demand meaning. He only noticed what others hurried past, and in noticing, the universe seemed to give him more. More silence, more stillness, more time. It was not the kind of stretching that changed worlds in explosions of light. It was the stretching of breath, of pauses, of holding a sandwich just before taking the first bite, small, invisible, eternal. And so his childhood unfolded, not in great leaps or dramatic turns, but in softened hours and lingering afternoons. He grew older, but time seemed to carry him gently, like a stream that refused to let him tumble. One night, as he lay in bed, Jerry whispered to the dark, "Thank you." He didn't know who he was thanking or if anyone could hear. But somewhere beyond the ceiling, beyond the roof, beyond the sky itself, the universe whispered back in its own wordless way. And the clock, just for a moment, slowed to listen. There is no rush in a story like Jerry's. His journey was never about racing forward. It was about lingering, about noticing, about letting the smallest things stretch wide enough to feel infinite. The first stretch of time was not an accident. It was an invitation. One that Jerry, in his quiet way, accepted with every breath. Some mornings arrive without ceremony, no grand sunrise, no blazing sky, just a thin wash of light that creeps across the curtains and lays itself gently over the world. Jerry loved those mornings most of all. He would wake slowly, not with the jolt of alarm clocks or the weight of heavy schedules, but with a kind of drifting awareness, as though the day had been waiting patiently for him. The air in his room would be still, touched only by the quiet hum of life outside. A bird's distant call, a car passing far away, the faint ticking of a clock that always seemed a beat too slow. It was in those mornings that Jerry felt the strange blessing of existence most clearly. He did not need to be anywhere. He did not need to prove anything. He only needed to notice. And so he would lie there, letting the quiet sunlight spill over him, and it felt, for reasons he could never explain, like love. Other people hurried through the mornings, swallowing coffee, rushing outdoors, pulling on coats with half-buttoned sleeves. But Jerry moved differently. He let mornings stretch. He lingered in the pause between waking and moving, savoring the way the sunlight seemed to sit with him, like an old friend who never asked for words. As a boy, he had sometimes thought the sunlight was watching him. He would roll onto his side and squint into the golden glow, whispering a soft hello under his breath, as if the light could answer. And though it never spoke, Jerry always felt the reply, not in sound but in warmth, in the soft insistence that he was not alone. Years later, he would hold on to this ritual. Even as life grew louder, even as responsibilities and disappointments pressed in, Jerry would pause for sunlight. He would step outside in the middle of the day, just to tilt his face upward, eyes half closed, letting the glow remind him of that first companionship. To others, it looked like idleness. To Jerry, it was survival, because in those moments, something quiet inside him aligned. The universe was vast, stars burning and galaxies colliding in endless violence, but the sunlight that reached him carried none of that chaos. It arrived softened, patient, warm. It was as if the infinite had decided to meet him halfway, to sit gently at the edge of his bed, and to say in the simplest language possible, "You are seen." Rick would never have believed it. To him, sunlight was only energy, filtered and refracted by atmosphere. Morty might have tried to believe, but his restless mind would have scattered too quickly. Only Jerry stayed still long enough to feel the truth hidden in the ordinary. The quiet sunlight became his companion through every stage of his life. On days when he felt overlooked, it poured itself across his shoulders as though to remind him he mattered. On nights when he dreamed strange dreams, he would wake to find the first soft rays waiting, and it was enough to carry him through. On afternoons when nothing seemed right, he would walk into the yard and close his eyes until the warmth steadied him. It was never about grandeur. Jerry never claimed visions, never built philosophies, never turned sunlight into sermons. He only received it the way a thirsty root receives water, without demand, without need for explanation. And in receiving, he was changed. One memory in particular stayed with him forever. He was still a boy, sitting alone on the back step of his house, his chin tucked to his knees. He had done poorly on a test at school, the kind of failure that weighs heavily on a child's fragile pride. The voices of disappointment lingered in his ears, the sense of never being quite enough. But as he sat there, the afternoon sunlight drifted low, spilling across the yard until it reached him. It wrapped him in warmth. It did not erase the failure, nor did it promise success. It simply sat with him, unjudging, unchanging. And in that moment, Jerry realized something his teachers had never taught him: that love did not always look like praise or applause. Sometimes it was as simple as a light that showed up, whether you were winning or not. That lesson never left him. And so, through the years, Jerry carried the quiet sunlight with him. Not literally, of course. Clouds came, rain fell, darkness arrived each night, but the memory of that warmth lived inside him, a reminder that even in his most ordinary moments, something vast and patient lingered nearby. When Morty was young, there were days Jerry tried to share it. He would nudge his son gently and say, "Look at that light. Isn't it beautiful?" Morty would nod politely, eager to run off to some louder adventure. Rick would mutter that it was just photons, but Jerry would only smile. He wasn't trying to convince them, he was only reminding himself, because the sunlight had always been his companion, his quiet reassurance, his unseen friend. And perhaps, in ways no one else understood, it was the universe's way of whispering back to him, the same whisper that had followed him since childhood. Through sandwiches, through pauses in time, through the ordinary glow of morning light, Jerry was being reminded, you are loved. You are enough. You do not need to hurry. And so another chapter of his life unfolded not in grand gestures, but in small mornings, quiet afternoons, and evenings softened by gold. There are moments in every life when silence feels less like absence and more like attention. For Jerry, this truth revealed itself slowly in fragments, as though the multiverse had always been leaning close, waiting for him to notice. He was older now, no longer just a drifting boy staring at clouds, but not yet the man who would stumble through adulthood with worried eyes. Somewhere in between, Jerry began to speak aloud to the quiet. Not because he thought anyone would answer, but because the air around him felt too alive to be empty. It started with small things. At night, when he couldn't sleep, he would whisper his fears into the dark. Fears about being forgotten at school, fears about his clumsy hands, fears about not being special. And though no voice came back, something shifted in the silence. The room did not stay cold, the stillness did not stay sharp. Instead, there was warmth, as if the very air had softened just to hold his words. Jerry took comfort in that. He told himself it was just imagination, but he kept talking anyway, because somewhere deep inside, he felt the listening. One evening, he sat beneath a tree in his backyard, legs folded awkwardly, a half-eaten sandwich at his side. The sky was wide and pale, clouds brushing softly over the edges of light. Jerry tilted his head back and said, "I don't know what I'm supposed to be." His voice was quiet but steady, carrying upward into branches and sky. And the wind stirred, not strong, not sudden, just enough to bend the leaves gently, enough to brush across his cheek like a hand. Jerry smiled. He didn't know why. From then on, the practice became a kind of ritual. He spoke to the universe in half-formed sentences, in questions with no expectation of reply. He told it about his mistakes, about the small victories no one else noticed, about the loneliness he sometimes carried like a hidden stone in his chest. And always the universe answered, not in words, but in its way. A bird would land near him, a cloud would part, sunlight would spill warm across his knees. It was as though creation itself bent closer each time, not to fix him, but to remind him, "I hear you." Years later, Rick would have dismissed it as coincidence, a trick of patterns in Jerry's wishful brain. Morty would have wanted to believe, but would struggle with doubt. Yet neither of them could deny that strange things seemed to gather around Jerry, not chaos, not brilliance, but moments of impossible tenderness. One afternoon, Jerry walked home from school slower than usual. His day had been heavy, weighed down by quiet disappointments he didn't want to speak aloud. As he turned the corner, he whispered, almost without meaning to, "I wish someone cared." And right then, the sky shifted. A patch of cloud opened, spilling a beam of golden light directly across his path. He stopped. He laughed under his breath. It was not proof. It was not evidence. But it was enough. From that day, Jerry began to trust the listening more deeply. He would pause in the middle of crowded rooms, letting his mind send unspoken words upward. He would murmur to the stars at night, half lullabies, half prayers, and always the reply came, not in answers, but in presence. There is a unique strength in being heard, even when no solution follows. For Jerry, that strength became a quiet anchor. When others ignored him, when his place in the world felt small, he remembered, somewhere vast and infinite, something was listening. And in that listening, he was enough. One night, lying on his bed with the window cracked open, Jerry whispered a simple thank you. He didn't know why gratitude rose in him, only that it felt right. The leaves outside rustled, the stars above shimmered, and in the hush of that hour, Jerry felt a love deeper than language. The universe had listened, and in listening, it had made him whole. It is easy to underestimate the power of such moments. People rush toward grand revelations, toward answers written in fire. But Jerry's life unfolded in softer ways. His revelations were found in silence, in the way the universe listened without judgment, without haste. And so, piece by piece, Jerry learned something most spend lifetimes missing, that to be heard, truly heard, even in the quietest of ways, is one of the greatest forms of love. Some objects enter a life so quietly, so without drama, that their meaning is only recognized much later. For Jerry it was a cup, just an old ceramic mug, plain, chipped at the rim, the kind that would be forgotten in most kitchens. But for Jerry it became something else entirely. It began one morning when he was still a teenager. He had wandered into the kitchen half asleep, searching for something warm. His father had left a pot of coffee on the counter, the dark liquid steaming faintly. Jerry poured some into the chipped mug and sat down, expecting nothing more than a bitter taste to wake him up. But as he sat there, watching the steam curl upward, he noticed something strange. The cup never cooled. Minutes passed, then half an hour. The warmth did not fade. The steam did not vanish. It was as if the coffee had been caught in the same stretched time Jerry had felt before, held in a moment that refused to move forward. At first, he thought it was a trick of his imagination. He touched the rim. It was warm. He sipped, still hot. He set it down, rubbed his eyes, and tried again. Still warm, still the same. Jerry didn't tell anyone. He wasn't sure how. Who would believe that an ordinary mug could hold warmth forever? But deep inside he knew this was not just coffee, it was a sign. Another whisper from the universe, another way of saying you are seen, even here, even now. He began to treasure that cup. Each morning he would pour coffee into it, sit by the window, and feel time pause for him. The world rushed outside, cars, conversations, clocks ticking toward deadlines. But Jerry sat in his corner, wrapped in a warmth that refused to leave him. There was something sacred about it, though Jerry never called it that. It was just coffee. Yet it felt alive, as if the universe itself had poured into that cup. Every sip carried not only taste, but reassurance. It told him he didn't need to keep up with the world's speed. He could linger, he could rest. And so he did. Years later, when he was older, when life felt heavier, Jerry would still reach for that mug. It never failed him. The warmth remained long after logic said it should have faded. Rick once noticed it on the counter, raising an eyebrow as steam still curled after hours. "Weird," he muttered, half interested, half dismissive. "Must be a glitch in thermodynamics." But he never studied it. Perhaps even Rick sensed that some mysteries weren't meant to be pulled apart. Morty, on the other hand, once sat across from Jerry as he cradled the mug. "Does it feel different?" Morty asked, curiosity shining in his eyes. Jerry only smiled softly and said, "It feels like it's listening." Morty didn't fully understand, but he didn't need to. The truth of the cup was not in its physics, but in its presence. There is something quietly holy in an object that stays warm when everything else grows cold. For Jerry, that mug became a symbol of companionship. On lonely mornings, it was a friend. On anxious afternoons, it was a reminder to breathe. On sleepless nights, it was a small flame that refused to die out. One evening, Jerry carried the cup into the yard. The stars were bright, scattered across the sky like spilled salt. He sat in the grass, holding the mug close, and whispered into the night, "Thank you." The steam drifted upward, vanishing into starlight, as if carrying his words with it. And in that moment, Jerry knew the coffee was not the miracle. The miracle was that the universe had chosen such a small, ordinary thing to love him through. He sipped, closed his eyes, and let the warmth stay. Life is filled with objects we overlook: cups, chairs, windows, sandwiches. To Jerry, they were never just things, they were bridges. tiny places where the infinite brushed against the ordinary, reminding him that love does not always arrive with trumpets. Sometimes it arrives in a chipped mug that never cools. And so, day after day, Jerry drank his coffee. Day after day, he lingered in the warmth. And day after day, the universe listened, patient and near. There are songs that never leave us, even when we forget the words. They drift through memory like faded threads, weaving themselves into quiet corners of the heart. For Jerry, that song was a lullaby, one his mother used to hum when he was very small. She never sang it loudly. It was not the kind of tune that filled a room. It was softer than that, a sound that lived just at the edge of hearing. Jerry remembered lying in bed, the blanket pulled high beneath his chin, while his mother sat nearby, her voice barely more than a whisper. The melody rose and fell like breathing, simple, unadorned, but filled with something deeper than words. He could not remember the lyrics, not exactly. They blurred with time, half-formed syllables that dissolved as he grew. But the feeling never left, the feeling of being wrapped in sound, safe and held. It was as though the lullaby itself carried him into sleep, not just with notes, but with love. As he grew older, Jerry would sometimes catch fragments of it when he least expected. Passing through a store, he'd hear a tune on the radio that bent into the same pattern. Walking alone at night, the wind might sigh in a rhythm that echoed her hum. Even the clink of dishes in the sink sometimes seemed to align with that long-ago melody. And whenever it came, Jerry would pause. His chest would tighten with a quiet ache. Not sadness exactly, but longing. Longing for something that was never quite gone, never fully present, but always waiting for him in the spaces between moments. He began to hum it himself, softly, though he could never recreate it perfectly. The tune slipped away as soon as he reached for it, like mist between his fingers. But even in its incompleteness, it soothed him. Sitting alone in his room, Jerry would hum into the stillness, and the stillness would hum back. There was a night, when he was just on the edge of manhood, that he felt the lullaby more strongly than ever. He had come home late, weary from the weight of feeling small in a world that demanded bigness. He lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, eyes heavy with the kind of tears that never fall. And then from nowhere the melody rose inside him, clearer than it had been in years. He hummed it once, then again, and with each repetition the room softened, the walls seemed to breathe with him, the air thickened, warm and gentle, until Jerry felt that same presence, the universe leaning close. It was not his mother's voice, not any more. It was something larger, something older, echoing her love through the fabric of existence itself. The lullaby had become more than memory. It had become language, the universe speaking back to him in notes too soft for anyone else to hear. Rick would have rolled his eyes. Morty might have looked at him with puzzled tenderness. But Jerry knew. He didn't need proof. He didn't need logic. He only needed the sound that lived in his chest, rising on breath, falling into silence, carrying him the way it always had. The echoes stayed with him. Sometimes they returned as he sipped coffee from his endless warm mug. Sometimes they brushed against him in sunlight. Sometimes they crept into his dreams, pulling him into sleep with a gentleness he thought he had lost. And each time Jerry listened. He let the notes linger. He let the love behind them settle into his bones, because the lullaby was never just a song, it was a promise that even in his most ordinary days, he was held by something vast, something that remembered him when he forgot himself. There is a particular kind of strength in carrying a song no one else can hear. It becomes a thread, weaving the past into the present, stitching together loneliness with love. Jerry carried that strength without realizing it. Every hum was a bridge, every echo was a reminder. And so, as the years stretched forward, the lullaby never left him. Its words might have faded, its notes might have blurred, but its heart remained. Software, steady, eternal. Jerry drifted to sleep that night with the melody still circling in his chest. The universe leaned close, listening, and for a moment, just a moment, it hummed along. Morty had a way of looking at the world that Jerry often envied. Where Jerry's eyes saw ordinariness, laundry baskets, tangled cords, half-empty ketchup bottles, Morty's gaze seemed to linger on small things as if they were clues. He didn't always speak of it, not directly, but Jerry noticed. A moth at the window could hold Morty's attention longer than television. Flicker in the corner of the night sky could pull him outside, staring upward until his neck ached. Jerry began to notice this more when the two of them shared quiet evenings. Rick would be gone, swallowed into some portal adventure, and the house would finally exhale. Jerry would find Morty sitting on the porch steps, his hands folded, his expression soft. Sometimes Jerry joined him without words, coffee in hand, watching his son watch the stars. At first, Jerry thought Morty was simply restless, searching for excitement, dreaming of a life beyond suburbia. But as the nights passed, he realized it was deeper. Morty wasn't just looking outward, he was listening to something Jerry couldn't hear. One evening, when the sky was especially clear, Morty whispered, "Do you ever think the stars remember us?" Jerry blinked, caught off guard. He wanted to laugh, but Morty's tone was too sincere. "Remember us?" he asked gently. "Yeah," Morty said. "Like when we look at them, maybe they're looking back. Maybe they don't forget who stares longest." Jerry didn't have an answer. He sipped from his mug and nodded slowly. "Maybe they do, Morty. Maybe they always have." That moment lingered. For Jerry, it revealed something he hadn't expected. Morty's wonder wasn't about escape. It was about connection. His son carried the same quiet yearning Jerry had felt as a child, the same sense that the universe was alive, waiting, listening. But where Jerry often drowned in self-doubt, Morty seemed to lean forward, reaching into that mystery with both hands. The wonder became a bridge between them, not in dramatic ways, not in declarations or speeches, but in simple silences. Jerry found himself humming the half-remembered lullaby as Morty gazed at the sky, and though the boy never mentioned it, Jerry saw the way Morty's shoulders eased when the tune floated near. There was another evening, one Jerry would never forget, when Morty pulled him outside suddenly. "Dad, come on, you got to see this." They stood in the yard, their breath clouding in the chill as Morty pointed upward. "There," he whispered, "that one's moving. Slow, like it doesn't want us to notice." Jerry squinted. At first, he saw nothing but the scattered dust of stars. Then faintly a flicker, an almost imperceptible drift among the still points of light. A star that shifted, hesitated, then resumed its place. Jerry's heart slowed, a hush settling in him. "I see it," he said softly. Morty nodded, eyes wide. Told you, it's like they're alive." For a long time they stood there together, watching the sky breathe. The moment asked for nothing, no proof, no explanation, just the willingness to believe. And Jerry did. For once, he believed, without questioning, without fumbling for meaning. He let Morty's wonder guide him, and the night seemed warmer for it. Over time, Jerry realized that Morty's wonder was not only about stars or moths or flickers in the dark. It was about faith, faith in the possibility that the universe might love back. And in that Jerry saw himself reflected. His son had inherited the same tender curiosity, the same soft ache to belong to something larger. There is a rare peace in sharing silence with someone who sees the world as you do. Jerry had never expected that gift to come from his son. Yet there it was, night after night, on the porch steps and in the starlight. And though Morty would never know it, his wonder became Jerry's anchor, proof that what Jerry felt as whispers and warmth was not just foolishness. It was real, woven into the very fabric of the family he thought he had disappointed. That night ended the way many did, with Morty yawning, retreating indoors, and Jerry lingering just a little longer beneath the stars. He sipped his endless warm coffee, hummed the lullaby under his breath, and whispered, "They'll remember you, Morty. They'll remember us both." And in the hush of the universe, he felt something shift. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to know he wasn't wrong. Jerry carried that moment for years. Every time Morty's eyes lit with curiosity, Jerry felt it again, the universe pressing close, listening, loving through the eyes of his son. Because Morty's wonder was more than a child's imagination. It was a reminder, love often hides in how we look at the world and in how the world quietly looks back. Silence was not something Rick Sanchez was known for. He was a storm of noise, belches, mutters, the crackle of his tools, the sting of his words. Yet there were rare nights when even Rick fell into quiet. Nights when the garage light hummed softly and he sat hunched over some unfinished invention, not with urgency, but with stillness. Jerry would sometimes wander there, uncertain of why. Maybe he hoped to be useful, though he never was. Maybe he just wanted to feel less alone. And sometimes Rick allowed it, not with words, not with invitation, but with the simple absence of dismissal. Jerry would stand in the doorway holding his eternal mug of coffee, and Rick would keep working, saying nothing. It was in those pauses that Jerry began to notice something unusual. Beneath the gruff exterior, Rick's silence carried a kind of weight, not emptiness, but density, like the hush of a deep ocean. It pressed against Jerry's chest, filled the air, made him feel that something enormous lived beneath the surface. One night, Jerry dared to step further in. He leaned on the workbench, watching the sparks fade from a soldering tool. "You ever think," Jerry began carefully, "that the quiet is alive?" Rick didn't answer at first. His hands kept moving, adjusting wires with practiced precision. Then finally he muttered, "You mean silence?" "It's just the absence of sound, Jerry. Nothing mystical about it." But Jerry shook his head. "No, I mean the kind of quiet that feels like it's holding you, like it's listening, like maybe it knows what you don't." Rick paused then, just for a heartbeat. He didn't look up, but his hand stilled, and Jerry saw the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, more like recognition. As if Jerry had stumbled too close to something Rick never said aloud. For a long time after, Rick said nothing. The silence returned, heavier now, and Jerry almost regretted speaking. Yet in that very heaviness, Jerry felt understood. Rick didn't need to agree. He didn't need to mock. The pause itself was answer enough. That became their unspoken ritual. Jerry would sit nearby, sometimes humming his half-remembered lullaby under his breath, while Rick tinkered. The hum filled the edges of the silence, and though Rick never acknowledged it, Jerry noticed how the man's shoulders eased when the tune was present, as if the melody slipped through the cracks in Rick's armor. There was one night Jerry would never forget. Rain tapped against the garage roof, soft and steady. Rick had been working for hours when he suddenly set his tools down and leaned back in his chair. He didn't speak, but his eyes drifted toward the open door, toward the rain-washed darkness beyond. Jerry followed his gaze. The night seemed endless, the kind of dark that could swallow everything. Yet within it, the rain made music, gentle, patient, eternal. Rick's face softened in that moment. The hard lines eased, just barely, as if the rain had reminded him of something Jerry could never know. And then, without turning, Rick murmured, "The universe doesn't always shout, Jerry. Sometimes it whispers. You just have to shut up long enough to hear it." Jerry's breath caught. It was the closest thing to wisdom Rick had ever offered him directly. He wanted to thank him, to say something that matched the weight of it, but the words never came. Instead, Jerry simply nodded and let the rain keep speaking. From then on, Jerry came to cherish Rick's silences as much as his words. In the hush, there was no mockery, no disappointment, no hierarchy, just two men, two lives, breathing the same air. And though Rick would never admit it, those silences became a bond. Fragile, fleeting, but real. Jerry sometimes thought of it as sitting beside a great river. Rick was the current, powerful, chaotic, unstoppable, but the river also had still pools where the water slowed, reflecting the stars above. That was where Jerry found him, in those still pools of quiet, where even Rick allowed himself to be human. And perhaps, Jerry thought, that was the greatest gift Rick ever gave him. Not words, not inventions, but silence. Silence that made Jerry feel less invisible, less small. Silence that suggested even Rick, in his vast brilliance and endless running, needed the comfort of stillness too. The rain ended, the night deepened, Rick returned to his work, but Jerry stayed seated, coffee up, cooling in his hands, heart warmed by the rare truth they had shared. The silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt alive. And as Jerry finally rose to leave, humming softly, he caught the faintest sound behind him. Not quite words, not quite a tune. Just Rick exhaling slowly, letting the silence hum back. Summer had always carried a brightness that Jerry admired from afar. Not the loud brightness of neon signs or television screens, but a steadier glow, like a lamp left on in a window. She moved through life with a certain surety that Jerry often lacked. While he second-guessed himself at every turn, Summer seemed to walk forward, even when she wasn't sure of the path. It wasn't that she never struggled. Jerry saw her doubts, her frustrations, but she wore them differently. Where Jerry's worries tangled around him like vines, Summer's slipped through her fingers like water. She let them go, or at least pretended to, and in that pretending, Jerry sometimes believed she truly could. One evening, Jerry found her sitting in the living room after everyone else had gone to bed. The television was off, the lights dim, and she sat curled beneath a blanket, the faint glow of her phone lighting her face. She didn't notice him at first. Jerry stood in the doorway, coffee in hand, unsure if he should retreat. Then she looked up, her expression softening. "You're up late too?" she asked. Jerry nodded, easing into the chair across from her. "Couldn't sleep." "Same," she said. "It's like the night won't leave me alone." Jerry chuckled quietly. "Yeah, I know that feeling." They sat in silence for a while. The house creaked around them, old wood settling like tired bones. Jerry sipped his coffee. Summer set her phone aside, and then, unexpectedly, she began to talk. "Do you ever wonder," she said slowly, "if we're just background characters in someone else's story?" Jerry blinked. The words startled him, though he had thought them himself in darker hours. "All the time," he admitted. Summer laughed softly, a sound both warm and sad. "Figures. But you know what? I don't think I mind. Even if I'm just the girl in the background, I can still shine a little. Like, even lamps in the window matter to someone out there, right?" Jerry felt a lump rise in his throat. She had spoken what he could never put into words, the ache of insignificance, softened by the choice to shine anyway. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, lamps matter. They always do." That moment stayed with him. Summer's light wasn't about being noticed or celebrated. It was about being present, even in small ways. She carried herself like a reminder that even if the universe was vast and indifferent, a single glow could still change the shape of the night. In the weeks that followed, Jerry began to notice her quiet kindnesses, the way she refilled water glasses without being asked, the way she lingered when Morty felt low, not trying to fix him, just sitting nearby. The way she rolled her eyes at Rick's arrogance, but still left snacks at his workstation when he forgot to eat. Small things, often unnoticed, but luminous when seen. Jerry thought of his own father once, long ago, telling him, "The world is too big to conquer. But it's never too big to brighten, just a little." He had forgotten those words for years, buried beneath doubt and self-mockery. But in summer, he saw them reborn. One night, as the stars pressed close against the windows, Jerry found himself humming his lullaby while Summer flipped through an old photo album on the couch. She looked up at him, eyebrows raised. "That song again?" she said softly. "Yeah," Jerry admitted. "It's, just something that stuck with me. Comfort, I guess." Summer smiled faintly. "It sounds safe, like it belongs in the background, the good kind of background." Her words disarmed him. For so long, Jerry had feared being nothing more than background. But when Summer said it that way, he realized background wasn't nothing. It was the canvas where the light could be seen. They shared a quiet laugh, and Jerry felt warmth bloom in his chest. For the first time, he wondered if maybe he hadn't failed his children as badly as he thought. Maybe, just maybe, some part of his softness had passed down to Summer. Not in words, but in the gentle persistence of kindness. Later that night, as the house fell back into stillness, Jerry whispered to himself, "She's the light, the one that makes the night gentler." And with that thought, he finally slept deeper than he had in weeks. Summer never knew the full extent of what her quiet glow gave her father, but Jerry carried it always, the knowledge that even in his shadows there lived a light that refused to go out. And in that light, Jerry felt less lost. He felt seen. Beth was Jerry's first great mystery. Long before multiverses, before portals and alien skies, there was only the quiet ache of trying to understand the woman he loved. She had been sharp even as a child, he often reminded himself, brilliant in ways he could never match. And that brilliance had always carried a distance with it, like the faint edge of a star that glowed but could never quite be touched. Jerry noticed it most in the evenings. Beth would sit at the kitchen table, polishing a glass of wine between her fingers, her gaze somewhere else. Past him, past the walls, staring into a world Jerry couldn't see. Sometimes he wondered if she was looking back at the little girl who wanted to be a surgeon, or at the alternate life where she had left them all behind. He never asked. He didn't want to break the spell, even if the spell was silence. Jerry often tried to bridge the space with small gestures. He would bring her tea, though she rarely drank it. He would ask about her work, though the answers came clipped and clinical. And yet, once in a while, something softened. Her eyes would linger on him for half a heartbeat longer, or her hand would rest on the table just close enough that he dared to brush against it. It was in those fragile moments Jerry felt it, the truth that distance and love could live together. Beth didn't always show her affection in words or gestures, but Jerry knew deep down that she carried it in her own quiet way. It was the kind of love that hid itself, uncertain, like a flame afraid of the wind. There was one night Jerry remembered most vividly. The power had gone out, and the house was steeped in darkness. Summer and Morty had lit candles in their rooms, and Rick, of course, had stormed off to the garage, muttering about circuits. Beth and Jerry sat together on the couch, wrapped in the dim orange glow of a single flame. Jerry shifted nervously, unsure of what to say, but before he could speak, Beth leaned back, her voice low and thoughtful. When I was a kid, I always thought power outages meant the stars were trying to talk louder, like maybe if everything else went quiet, you could finally hear them. Jerry blinked. He hadn't expected her to share something so soft, so vulnerable. "Did you ever hear them?" he asked gently. Beth's lips curved into a faint smile. "Maybe, or maybe I just wanted to believe I wasn't alone in the dark." For a long time after, they sat in silence, listening to the faint hum of the night beyond the windows. Jerry realized then that Beth's distance wasn't emptiness. It was longing for the stars, for dreams she had set aside, for the person she might have been. And maybe, just maybe, for him too. It wasn't always easy. There were mornings when Beth's voice cut sharp, and Jerry shrank beneath the weight of her disappointment. There were nights when she didn't come to bed, choosing instead to drink and stare at the walls. But even in those moments, Jerry sensed a thread that bound them, a quiet, unseen tether stretching between two hearts that didn't always know how to speak, but still refused to let go. Jerry began to understand that love wasn't always closeness. Sometimes it was learning to stand steady while the person you loved drifted, trusting they would come back in their own time. Beth needed her distance the way the stars needed their sky. And Jerry, for all his fumbling, found comfort in being the ground beneath her feet when she finally returned. One evening, as he watched her rinse dishes at the sink, Jerry murmured softly, "You know, I don't always get you. But I don't think I need to. I'm glad you're here." Beth paused, her hands stilled beneath the water. Then, without turning, she whispered back, "Me too." It was a small moment, easy to miss, but for Jerry it was enough to carry for years. Beth's distance remained, but Jerry no longer feared it as he once had. Instead, he learned to see it as part of her light, like the stars she once listened for in the silence. And though they were not always close, Jerry knew that some loves are not measured by touch or words, but by the quiet gravity that keeps two souls circling each other, even across the spaces between. Morty had always looked at Jerry with a kind of puzzled affection. To him, his father wasn't a hero, wasn't brilliant like Rick, and wasn't sharp like Beth. But Jerry was something else, something gentler, something less demanding of the world. And though Morty would never say it outright, there was a quiet trust between them, a trust Jerry didn't always know how to hold. Jerry often felt he disappointed his son. He couldn't build ray guns or chart galaxies. He couldn't even fix the squeak in the back door. Morty came home with stories of impossible adventures, of planets with breathing skies and gods that died and rose again, and Jerry's response was often just a nod, a weak, "Wow, that sounds something." Yet in the quieter hours, when the glow of those wild journeys faded, it was Jerry Morty drifted toward. Not Rick, not Beth, just his father, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, the clock ticking in the background. One night, after another long, chaotic day with Rick, Morty appeared in the doorway, his face pale with exhaustion. Jerry glanced up. "Hey, sport," he said softly. "Couldn't sleep?" Morty shook his head and sat down across from him. For a moment, they just listened to the hum of the refrigerator, Then Morty muttered, "Dad, when we're out there, sometimes I feel like I'm disappearing. Like, no matter how much I do, it's never enough for him. And then I start wondering if I'm even real." The words landed heavily and Jerry's chest tightened. He reached out slowly, unsure if his touch would be welcome. But Morty didn't flinch when Jerry laid a hand on his shoulder. "You're real to me?" Jerry whispered. Morty looked up, his eyes searching. And in that small exchange, Jerry realized something he had never put into words. Trust wasn't about proving strength or brilliance or heroism. Trust was about being there when the night was heavy. It was about being steady when everything else spun too fast. Over time, Jerry noticed little things that Morty only shared with him. A joke muttered under his breath after everyone else had stopped laughing, a worry about school, a memory from childhood that Morty didn't even bring up with Summer. They weren't big confessions, but they were gifts, tiny seeds of trust placed carefully in Jerry's clumsy hands. Jerry carried them carefully. He tried not to drop them, not to make them feel small. Sometimes he failed. Sometimes he laughed too loud or gave advice that Morty clearly didn't want. But still, the trust remained, fragile yet resilient. One evening, they found themselves walking in the backyard under a pale half-moon. Morty kicked at the grass, restless. "Do you think I'll ever be enough?" he asked suddenly. Jerry stopped walking. The question pierced him, and not just because it came from Morty, but because it was the very question that had haunted Jerry his whole life. He drew in a shaky breath. "You already are. You don't have to earn it. Not from me." Morty froze, staring at his father. And then, slowly, he nodded, as though filing the words away somewhere safe. It wasn't a grand moment. The moonlight was thin, the night breeze cool, but for Jerry it was sacred. After that, Jerry began humming his quiet lullaby more often, and though Morty never said it, Jerry sometimes caught him humming it too, softly, when he thought no one was listening. That was trust too, a secret melody passed from father to son across the fragile bridge of understanding. Jerry came to see that Morty's trust wasn't about looking up to him as a hero. It was about leaning on him as a human being, flawed and fumbling but steady in his own way. And for Jerry, that was enough, more than enough. Years later, Jerry would remember those small, hushed nights, the kitchen conversations, the moonlit walks, the lullabies shared in fragments. They were not stories Rick would ever care about. They were not adventures to be catalogued in any dimension. But they were real, and they were his, and in them, Jerry discovered that trust is sometimes the most heroic gift of all. And in Morty's trust, Jerry found the part of himself he had been searching for all along. It began with something small, not a portal, not a weapon, not a revelation about the multiverse, just a sandwich. Jerry had always liked making them, stacking the bread with quiet care, spreading condiments with a patience that almost surprised even him. To most, it was an ordinary thing. To Jerry, it was an offering. He remembered the first time he made one for Beth after they were married. It was nothing special, just ham, cheese, a thin line of mustard. She had taken a distracted bite, half listening to the radio, and muttered, "Thanks." Jerry had smiled as though she had sung to him, because it wasn't about the sandwich. It was about giving her something he had touched, something he had thought about. A piece of himself folded between slices of bread. Morty noticed it too. As a boy, he had come home from school, tired and deflated, to find a peanut butter and jelly waiting on the table. Jerry didn't say much, just slid it across with a nod. Morty ate in silence, but years later he admitted that those simple offerings made him feel safe, like someone had remembered him in a world that often forgot. And so, sandwiches became Jerry's language. He couldn't invent machines or fix timelines, but he could place two slices together and hand them over, whispering without words, "I see you. You matter. You are loved." There was one evening that stayed with him above the rest. Rick had stormed out after another argument with Beth. The house felt jagged with silence, as though everyone's voices had been left behind in pieces. Jerry retreated to the kitchen. His hands moved slowly, almost automatically. Bread, lettuce, turkey, tomato. He layered each ingredient with care, not thinking of flavor, but of comfort, of something whole in a moment that felt broken. Summer wandered in, her face tired. "What are you doing?" she asked. Jerry looked down at the sandwich, then back at her. "Making something that doesn't fall apart." She blinked, caught off guard, and then quietly, she took the sandwich from him. She didn't say thank you, not then, but she ate it, leaning against the counter, and when she was finished, she lingered close, her shoulder brushing his. For Jerry, that was enough. The sandwiches became a thread through the years. On rainy days, when the world seemed grey, Jerry made grilled cheese for Morty and Summer. On mornings Beth was too distracted to eat. He left one wrapped in foil on the dashboard of her car. Even Rick, on rare occasions, took one without comment, muttering something under his breath about primitive nutrition before finishing it in silence. What surprised Jerry most was how the sandwiches seemed to circle back to him. Once, after a particularly long and painful day, Jerry came home to find a plate on the table. It was Morty's attempt at a sandwich, messy, uneven, peanut butter smeared too thick. Jerry laughed softly, his chest aching. He sat down, took a bite, and whispered, "Perfect." The motif followed Jerry even in dreams. Some nights, when the universe pressed too heavy, he closed his eyes and saw himself in an endless kitchen where the bread never ran out, and every sandwich he made drifted softly into the hands of someone who needed it. Strangers, friends, even versions of himself in other worlds, each one holding the small gift with quiet gratitude. It wasn't grandeur, it wasn't legacy in the way Rick might have defined it, but for Jerry it was sacred. A sandwich was small enough to be overlooked, humble enough to be forgotten. Yet in its quietness it carried love, it carried care, it carried him. And perhaps, Jerry thought, the universe itself was built of such offerings, small, unnoticed gestures, holding the world together in ways no one ever spoke of. That night, as he placed one last sandwich in the fridge for whoever might find it tomorrow, Jerry hummed his lullaby under his breath. He imagined it drifting through the bread, through the cheese, through the slices of tomato, carrying with it a soft whisper. You are safe. You are loved. You belong. And somewhere in the quiet spaces of the multiverse, Jerry's sandwiches became more than food. They became reminders of presence, of care, of a man who, in all his fumbling, still found a way to leave a mark. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Rick Sanchez was never quiet. His voice filled every corner of a room, sharp with sarcasm or weighed down with theories no one had asked to hear. He spoke as though silence were an enemy, something to be drowned out with noise, science, or drink. Yet, once in a rare while, even Rick fell still. It happened late one night. The house was wrapped in darkness, every light turned off except the faint glow of the refrigerator. Jerry wandered in, half awake, looking for water. He stopped short when he saw Rick sitting alone at the kitchen table. No flask, no gadgets, just Rick, hunched forward, his eyes unfocused. Jerry almost turned back. He wasn't used to catching Rick unguarded, and he wasn't sure he wanted to. but something in the air held him there, a stillness that felt fragile, like if he left it would shatter. "You're up late," Jerry said softly. Rick didn't move. His eyes flickered toward Jerry, then back to the table. "Couldn't sleep." The words were quiet, almost human. Jerry hesitated, then sat down across from him. The refrigerator hummed, filling the silence they shared. For the first time in memory, Jerry realized he wasn't afraid of Rick, not annoyed, not defensive, just present. "Do you ever," Rick began, his voice rough, "look around and wonder if any of this means anything?" Jerry blinked. "All the time." Rick let out a broken chuckle, almost bitter. "Yeah, I figured. But when I say it, it's supposed to sound profound. When you say it, it just sounds obvious." Jerry shrugged. "Maybe that's the point. It doesn't have to be profound to be real." Rick stared at him. The silence stretched again, heavy, but not suffocating. Jerry shifted uncomfortably, then without knowing why, reached for the fridge. He pulled out bread, cheese, and a few scraps of leftover turkey. Rick raised an eyebrow. "Really? Midnight sandwich?" Jerry didn't answer, just started stacking the pieces together, his movements steady and calm. A few minutes later, he slid the plate across the table. "Here!" Rick stared at it as though it were an alien device. "I don't eat carbs this late," he muttered, but he didn't push it away. After a moment, he picked it up, took a bite, and chewed slowly. He didn't make a joke. He didn't insult the effort. He just ate. The silence deepened, but now it felt different. Not empty, shared. After a long while, Rick whispered, almost to himself, "You know, you're the only one who doesn't expect me to be. Rick, you just expect me to sit here and eat this lousy sandwich." Jerry's chest tightened, though he tried to hide it. "Well, maybe that's enough sometimes." Rick looked at him then, really looked. His eyes were tired, red at the edges, but there was something else too, something like gratitude. He didn't say it aloud. Rick wasn't built for that, but Jerry felt it anyway, like a rare warmth passing between them. They sat there for what felt like hours, neither needing to fill the silence. For once, Rick didn't lecture, and Jerry didn't stumble over words. There was only the hum of the refrigerator, the steady rhythm of breathing, and the soft, unseen thread that bound them in that fragile moment. When Rick finally rose, he didn't mutter an insult or storm away. He just nodded once, a small acknowledgement, and left the kitchen. Jerry stayed behind, staring at the empty plate. It wasn't a grand breakthrough, it wasn't forgiveness or transformation. But it was something Jerry would carry in his heart for the rest of his life. The memory of a night when Rick Sanchez, loud, chaotic, unstoppable Rick, had allowed silence to exist. And in that silence, Jerry had been enough. Later, when Jerry thought back to that night, he realized something. Sometimes the rarest gift wasn't wisdom or power, it was quiet. It was the choice not to speak, not to fight, not to demand. It was presence, pure and unadorned. And though Rick would never admit it, Jerry suspected that night mattered to him too. It was late summer when Morty asked Jerry to sit outside with him. The night was warm but not heavy, the kind of evening where the air carried the faint smell of grass and the crickets hummed like a gentle choir. Jerry brought a blanket, spreading it clumsily across the lawn, and together they lay on their backs, staring upward. Above them stretched the night sky, vast and indifferent, sprinkled with stars that had been burning long before either of them was born. Morty shifted, his head sinking into the blanket. "You ever think about how far away they are?" he asked softly. Jerry nodded. "All the time. Sometimes it makes me feel small." But sometimes it makes me feel safe too, like if those stars have been shining for billions of years, maybe it's okay if I don't have all the answers right now." Morty was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, almost whispering, "Sometimes I wish the stars could remember us. You know? Like, when we're gone, maybe they still keep some part of us alive." Jerry's chest tightened. He turned to look at his son, noticing the way Morty's eyes glistened in the faint starlight. "I think they do," Jerry said carefully. "Not with names, not with faces, but with feelings. Every laugh, every hug, every time we love someone, it drifts upward somehow. Maybe the stars carry it. Maybe that's why they shine." Morty let out a shaky laugh. "That sounds like something Mom would roll her eyes at." "Maybe," Jerry admitted with a small smile, "but it's true for me, and maybe that's enough." The two of them lay in silence, watching the constellations. Rick had once explained them with cold precision, mapping each one to coordinates and wormholes. But Jerry and Morty didn't need the science. They needed the stillness, the quiet awe of just being there together. Jerry thought about his own childhood. He remembered nights when he had stared at the same sky, wondering if anyone else in the world felt as lost as he did. Back then, he hadn't known how to voice his fears, so he carried them alone. But now, lying beside his son, he felt something different, an unspoken bond, a promise that neither of them had to face the silence by themselves. "You know," Jerry murmured, "when you were little, you used to point at the stars and say they were nightlights for the universe. You said they kept the monsters away." Morty turned his head, surprised. "I said that?" "Yeah. And you believed it with your whole heart?" Jerry chuckled softly. "Maybe I still do." Morty's eyes softened, and for a moment, Jerry saw the boy he used to carry on his shoulders, pointing at the sky with wonder. Time had changed so much, and yet, lying there, Jerry realized some things never truly left. The stars, the laughter, the feeling of holding someone close, it all lingered, shimmering like faint echoes. A shooting star streaked across the sky, quick and delicate, as if reminding them of how fleeting everything could be. Jerry closed his eyes and made a wish. Not for wealth, not for adventure, not for glory. Just for his children to know always that they were loved. He didn't tell Morty the wish. He didn't have to. Some things were too sacred to speak, but they glowed all the same. The night grew quieter. Even the crickets seemed to hush, as though giving father and son the space to breathe in the memory they were creating. Jerry reached over, resting his hand lightly on Morty's shoulder. No words, just presence. And in that moment, under the endless sprawl of stars, Jerry realized something. He didn't need to conquer the universe or rewrite his story. His legacy was right here, on a blanket in the grass, beside a boy who carried both questions and hope in his heart. The stars shone above them, silent witnesses to their bond. And though the night would end, though they would eventually rise and return to their separate paths, the memory of this stillness would remain, carried not only by Jerry and Morty, but perhaps, just perhaps, by the stars themselves. The house was unusually quiet that night. Rick had vanished into one of his labs, Morty had drifted to sleep with headphones still tangled around his neck, and Summer's room was lit faintly by the glow of her phone. Jerry padded softly down the hall, restless as ever, unsure why his heart felt heavy. He passed Beth's door and noticed it was ajar. Inside, she was sitting on the edge of her bed, her back to the door. In her hands was a small glass of water that caught the moonlight, but she wasn't drinking. She was humming. Jerry froze, his breath catching. It was a melody he had never heard before, faint and slow, like something meant to soothe a child. It wasn't perfect. Beth's voice wavered. cracked in places, but there was a tenderness in it that Jerry couldn't look away from. For a long moment he simply stood there, afraid to interrupt. The tune curled through the room like smoke, wrapping around him, tugging at something deep in his chest. He felt as though he were intruding on a memory, one that had been waiting in the silence for decades. Finally, Beth noticed him. She startled, cutting off the song. "Dad!" she whispered sharply. "How long have you been standing there?" Jerry lifted his hands in surrender. "Not long. I didn't mean to eavesdrop. I just couldn't walk away." Beth looked down at her glass, her jaw tight. For a moment, Jerry thought she'd snap, that she'd push him out with one of her sharp-edged remarks. But instead, she sighed. "It was something I used to sing to myself when I was little, before Mom left, before Rick came back." Jerry stepped inside quietly, closing the door behind him. He sat on the floor instead of the bed, like a listener waiting at the feet of a storyteller. "It was beautiful," he said gently. Beth's expression softened, though her eyes remained distant. "It wasn't really a lullaby. More like a secret. I didn't want anyone to hear me. I thought if I kept it mine, then maybe it couldn't be taken away." Jerry felt his throat tighten. He wished he could go back in time, sit with the small girl who had carried loneliness like a second skin, and tell her she wasn't alone. But all he had was now. "Do you remember the words?" he asked softly. Beth hesitated, then shook her head. "Not anymore, just the shape of it. The way it felt, like wrapping a blanket around myself when no one else would." Jerry swallowed hard. "You know, sometimes I think the songs we sing when we're young never really leave us. Even if we forget the words, they stay in the rhythm of our hearts, in the way we hold our children, in the way we try to love, even when it's messy." Beth glanced at him, her eyes searching. For once, Jerry didn't try to fill the silence with jokes or excuses. He just let her see the sincerity bare and unpolished. After a long pause, she whispered, "When Summer was a baby, I tried humming it to her once." She stopped crying, just stopped. I think she knew somehow that it was mine, that it was hers too. Jerry smiled softly. "Then maybe it's not hidden anymore. Maybe it lives on in her, and in you." Beth blinked back tears she didn't want him to see. She turned her face toward the window, where the moonlight spilled across the floor. Her voice was quieter than the hum had been, but Jerry heard it clearly. "I don't know why I told you." He didn't answer right away. He simply leaned back against the wall, letting the silence stretch into something tender instead of sharp. Then finally he said, "Because you trusted me with it, and I promise I'll carry it carefully." Beth closed her eyes, her breathing slow and steady, as though she were finally allowing herself to rest. Jerry remained on the floor until he was sure she had drifted off to sleep. He didn't want to move, afraid of breaking the fragile peace that had settled over the room. When he finally slipped out, the melody lingered in his mind. He hummed it softly to himself in the hallway, not quite right, but close enough. It felt like a gift, a thread connecting the woman Beth had become to the child she once was, a secret now shared, a lullaby that would never truly vanish. And as Jerry crawled into his own bed, he realized something simple but profound. Some songs aren't meant to be remembered in perfect notes or lyrics. They're meant to be felt, carried quietly from one heart to another, like a flame passed between candles. Beth's lullaby would live on, not because it was sung aloud, but because Jerry had heard it once, in the stillness of the night, and had promised to never let it go. Summer had always carried herself with a kind of quiet defiance. Not loud like Rick's, not fragile like Jerry's, but steady, simmering beneath the surface. She knew when to roll her eyes, when to snap back, and when to hold her silence like a weapon. But there was one night, a night almost forgotten, when her rebellion had been something softer, almost tender. It happened on a Tuesday, long after midnight. The house was asleep. Morty's gentle snoring drifted through the wall. Beth's light still glowed under her door, and Rick's workshop buzzed faintly with machinery. But Summer slipped outside alone, barefoot in the cool grass, holding something clutched tightly in her hands. It was a notebook. Not one of her school assignments, not her phone, not even a diary with locks and glitter. Just a plain notebook with bent corners and smudged pages. Inside, she had drawn sketches of stars, doodles of strange creatures she had seen in Rick's garage, and lines of half-formed poetry that she never dared read aloud. Jerry, restless as always, had noticed her shadow pass his window. Curious, and perhaps a little protective, he followed quietly, careful not to startle her. He found her at the edge of the yard, sitting cross-legged, scribbling furiously in the moonlight. "Summer," he said softly, not wanting to frighten her. She whipped around, clutching the notebook to her chest. "Dad, what are you doing out here?" Jerry raised his hands gently, his voice low. "Sorry, sweetie. Couldn't sleep. I saw you slip out. Just wanted to make sure you were okay." Summer narrowed her eyes, but relaxed slightly. "I'm fine. I needed space." Jerry hesitated, then lowered himself onto the grass a few feet away. The dew chilled his hands as he leaned back, staring at the stars above. "Space is good," he murmured. "Sometimes it's the only thing that listens." For a while, neither spoke. The night wrapped them in its quiet, only the faint hum of cicadas filling the air. Then Summer sighed and slowly set the notebook down between them. "Don't laugh, okay?" Jerry leaned forward carefully, his heart aching at the vulnerability in her voice. "I'd never laugh." She opened it to a page where she had drawn a crooked constellation, lines connecting stars that didn't quite exist. Beneath it, in her neat but hesitant handwriting, were the words, "The sky doesn't care if I get it wrong. It shines anyway." Jerry blinked, his chest tightening. "Summer? That's beautiful." She shrugged, defensive. "It's just dumb stuff. I don't want Rick finding it. He'd call it pointless. And Mom, she'd probably just tell me to focus on school." Jerry reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of the notebook. "It's not pointless, it's you. And that's never pointless." Summer bit her lip, eyes flicking toward the ground. "You really think so?" "I know so," Jerry said softly. "You don't have to shout to rebel, Summer. Sometimes the bravest thing is keeping something of your own, something no one else gets to rewrite." The words seemed to sink into her. She closed the notebook gently, holding it to her chest again. "This is mine," she whispered, almost like a vow. "Not Rick's, not Mom's, not anyone's." Jerry smiled, the moonlight painting his face in pale silver. "Then keep it safe. Keep it stubbornly yours, because when the world tries to take pieces of you, and it will, you'll need something to remind you who you've always been." Summer didn't answer right away, but the tightness in her shoulders eased. She leaned back on the grass beside him, the notebook pressed between her palms. Together father and daughter watched the night sky, a silent rebellion shared between them. It wasn't the kind of defiance Rick would admire, or the kind of achievement Beth would praise. It wasn't loud, or spectacular, or cosmic, but it mattered. It was hers. And as Jerry glanced at his daughter, her face softened by the starlight, He thought of all the ways rebellion could look. Sometimes it was standing tall, sometimes it was breaking away, but sometimes, just sometimes, it was as simple as protecting a fragile piece of yourself. When they finally rose to go inside, Summer tucked the notebook under her arm, a secret flame she would carry forward. Jerry didn't ask to read more. He didn't need to. He had seen enough to know his daughter was carving her own path, quiet but unyielding. And in the stillness of that Tuesday night, Jerry realized that rebellion didn't always break things. Sometimes it saved them. There was an old wooden bridge not far from the Smiths' house, one that most people had forgotten. It stretched across a lazy river, its planks uneven, its railings worn smooth by rain and time. During the day, it looked ordinary, almost fragile. But at night, when the moon painted the water silver and the air stilled, the bridge felt like something else, like a threshold between the waking world and the dream of another. Rick had led them there once, years ago, claiming it was a shortcut. But Jerry remembered it differently. To him, the bridge became a kind of quiet sanctuary, a place where words seemed softer, where silence stretched in ways that didn't feel heavy. It was here, one evening, that the family had gathered again, not for any adventure, not because the universe demanded it, but simply because Jerry had suggested a walk. Beth carried a lantern. Morty shuffled with tired steps, clutching his hoodie. Summer trailed behind with her headphones resting around her neck. And Rick, surprisingly, didn't complain. He walked slowly, as though even he respected the night. When they reached the middle of the bridge, they stopped. The river below whispered in gentle currents, carrying with it the reflection of stars. The boards creaked beneath their feet, but the sound only deepened the stillness around them. Jerry leaned against the railing, staring at the water. "You know," he began, "I used to come here when I felt like the world didn't make sense. The bridge didn't fix anything, but it felt like it was listening." Summer gave a faint smile. "A bridge that listens. That's peak dad-level weirdness." Jerry chuckled softly, not offended. "Maybe, but don't you feel it? Like if you whispered a dream into the wood, it might carry it across?" Beth tilted her head, her lantern casting a golden glow over her face. "Dreams carried across a river," she murmured. "That's almost poetic." Morty leaned on the railing, gazing at the stars mirrored in the water. "Okay, if this bridge really listens, then I'd want it to know I just want things to stay simple, not perfect, just quiet enough that I can breathe." Summer lowered her eyes, hugging her notebook under her arm. "I'd want it to know that I don't want to disappear into everyone else's noise. I just want a piece of me to stay mine." Beth sighed softly, her voice lower than the lantern light. "I'd want it to know I've been strong for so long. I don't always want to be. I want to be allowed to rest, even if just for a while." The river hushed beneath them as if absorbing each word. Then, to their surprise, Rick spoke. He didn't look at anyone, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I'd want it to know that even when I act like nothing matters, some things do, more than I let on." Jerry's throat tightened. He swallowed and looked at his reflection in the water, distorted but still his. "I'd want it to know that I love all of you, even if I say it too quietly, even if I never say it enough." No one answered, but the silence was warm. The family stood together, bound not by arguments or expectations, but by the fragile truth of shared wishes. A breeze stirred, the lantern flame flickered. For a moment it felt as though the bridge itself sighed, an exhale long held. Jerry imagined the wooden beams soaking in their words, carrying them gently across the water, sending them somewhere unknown. Maybe into dreams, maybe into the stars. The night stretched onward. Eventually, Morty yawned. Summer adjusted her headphones. Beth closed the lantern. Rick lit a cigarette but didn't speak. And Jerry, with a small, contented ache in his chest, turned to lead them home. As they walked off the bridge, he glanced back once. The planks gleamed faintly in the moonlight, like threads of memory. He felt certain the bridge would keep their dreams safe long after their footsteps faded. There are moments that come not like thunder, but like a hush. Moments that don't demand to be remembered, yet linger tucked quietly in the folds of the heart. For Morty, one such moment returned one evening, long after he thought it had been lost. It began with a dream. In it he was younger. No adventures, no scars of strange universes, no echoes of Rick's reckless experiments. Just a boy sitting cross-legged on the living room carpet, building something small out of wooden blocks. His mother hummed in the kitchen. His father tried to read a magazine, fumbling with the pages, and somewhere, though Morty couldn't see where, a lullaby drifted through the house. When he awoke, the melody clung to him like morning fog. He sat up in bed, his chest rising and falling as he tried to place it. The tune was simple, almost childlike, but every note seemed to carry a weight he couldn't name. He hummed it under his breath, hesitant at first, then steadier. Later that day, when the family gathered for dinner, Morty found himself humming again without realizing. Summer noticed first. What's that noise you're making? You sound like a broken kettle." Morty flushed. It's just this song. I don't know where it came from. I think I used to know it when I was little." Beth looked up from her plate, her expression softening. "You did," she said quietly. "I used to hum it to you when you couldn't sleep. My mum hummed it to me too." Morty blinked, surprised. "Really?" Beth nodded. "It wasn't a real song, not from anywhere, just something she made up, a melody without words. She said it was meant to carry dreams gently to the next morning." For a moment, silence settled over the table. Even Rick paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. Then Jerry, with a tentative smile, said, "I remember that too. Beth hummed it once to me when I couldn't stop worrying. It worked, you know, calmed me down." Summer leaned back, crossing her arms, but her tone was softer than her posture. "Weird. It's like a family secret lullaby or something." Morty lowered his eyes, the melody still circling inside him. "It feels, familiar, like it's been waiting for me to remember." That night, Morty lay awake, the window open to the hum of crickets. Slowly, quietly, he hummed the tune again. It filled the room, fragile but steady. And in the half-light, something in him loosened. Some knot he hadn't known was tied. Jerry knocked softly on his door. "Hey, champ, still awake?" "Yeah," Morty murmured. Jerry slipped inside, sitting on the edge of the bed. He listened for a while, letting the tune drift between them. "That song," he said at last, "it's like a thread. It doesn't say much, but it holds things together." Morty stared at the ceiling. "It makes me feel like I don't have to carry everything alone, like maybe someone's humming with me even if I can't hear them." Jerry's eyes glistened. He reached out, resting a hand gently on his son's shoulder. "You're not alone, Morty. You never were. That song, it's proof. It's been passed down heart to heart. Even when we forget it, it waits, just like love does." Morty swallowed, his chest heavy but warm. He didn't answer, only kept humming, softer now, until Jerry joined him. Their two voices blended awkwardly at first, but then, strangely, they fit. Through the thin walls, Beth heard them. Summer did too, and even Rick, though he didn't come out of his lab, paused to listen. For a fleeting moment the house was filled not with arguments, not with noise, but with a quiet song that belonged only to them. Morty fell asleep with the melody still on his lips, and somewhere deep inside he carried it into his dreams. The forgotten song was no longer forgotten. It had returned to him, not as a memory, but as a reminder that some things, soft, fragile things, survive even across generations of noise. And the night seemed to hum along with him, carrying the tune out into the stars. Some nights Rick Sanchez didn't reach for a flask, or a vial of something dangerous, or the controls of his portal gun. Some nights he reached for nothing more than a glass of water. It was strange, even to him. The man who had crossed galaxies, who had walked through black holes and returned with stardust still clinging to his boots, found himself in certain quiet hours filling a plain glass from the kitchen sink. No ice, no fizz, just water, cool and clear. He would sit at the table alone, shoulders slouched, the overhead light buzzing faintly. The glass would sweat against his fingers, and for a long while he would just look at it. There was something honest in water, something unshaped, unclaimed. He liked that it didn't try to be anything other than itself. No explosions, no formulas, no cleverness, just a calm surface reflecting the lines of his face. That evening, as the house dozed in silence, Rick sat again with his glass of water. Morty had gone to bed early, Summer's music had finally softened to a murmur, and Beth and Jerry's laughter carried faintly from the living room. For once, Rick didn't leave. He stayed. He took a sip. The taste was nothing, and yet everything. For a man who had swallowed entire universes of noise, the nothingness was a kind of relief. He let it linger. A memory rose uninvited. He was a boy again, younger than Morty, running across a yard in summer heat, his throat dry, his chest aching. He remembered the way his mother's hand had placed a cup of water in his own, the way he'd gulped it down, spilling half of it on his shirt. The way she had laughed softly, brushing his hair back from his forehead. The glass trembled slightly in Rick's hand now. He set it down, staring at the surface until it steadied. Funny, he muttered to no one, all that science, and this is the only thing that feels real. Jerry appeared then, rubbing his eyes. He stopped in the doorway, surprised to see Rick sitting quietly. "Can't sleep?" Rick smirked faintly, not looking up. "Can't live, can't sleep. Pick your poison." Jerry hesitated, then walked over and sat across from him. He looked at the glass. "Water, huh? Didn't expect that." Rick shrugged. "It's the most honest drink in the multiverse. Doesn't lie, doesn't pretend, just exists." Jerry tilted his head, thoughtful. "You know, my dad used to say water remembers the shape of every glass it's poured into. That's why it feels familiar, no matter where you drink it." Rick raised an eyebrow, "And that's not scientifically accurate." "Maybe not," Jerry said softly. "But it feels true, doesn't it?" For a moment, Rick didn't argue. He just stared at the faint ripples his hand had made in the glass. "Maybe it does." They sat in silence for a long time, the kind of silence that wasn't empty but shared. The house around them breathed softly. Somewhere upstairs, Morty turned in his sleep. Finally, Rick lifted the glass and finished it in one slow swallow. The last drop clung to the rim before sliding free. He set the glass down with care, as though it was something fragile. Jerry smiled faintly. "Want me to get you another?" Rick shook his head. "Nah, one's enough." His voice was quieter now, almost a whisper. "It always is." Jerry didn't press. He only nodded as if he understood, and maybe, in some small way, he did. Rick stood, stretched, and turned to leave. But before he stepped away, he glanced back at the empty glass on the table. For the first time in a long time, he felt lighter, not fixed, not healed, but lighter, the way water feels when it carries itself without weight. And in that hush, in that simplicity, Rick Sanchez allowed himself to believe, just for a moment, that even a man like him could be enough, the way water is enough. Summer had always felt like a shadow in her own house. Not unseen exactly, but misplaced, like a candle in a room already full of lamps. She loved her family, but there were nights when she wondered if anyone really heard her voice beneath the noise of Rick's inventions, Morty's nervous stumbles, or Beth and Jerry's fragile dance around each other. One night, when the house finally fell silent, Summer slipped outside. The sky stretched vast and velvet above her, the stars scattered like crumbs of forgotten light. She carried with her a small lantern, a simple thing, its metal frame chipped, its glass smudged with fingerprints. She had found it earlier in the garage, tucked behind broken tools and dust. When she lit it, the glow surprised her. It wasn't bright or flashy, but soft, like the warmth of a secret being whispered. She held it in her hands and watched the circle of light pulse against the darkness. For reasons she couldn't name, she walked. Past the fence, down the quiet street, into the open field where crickets sang. The lantern swayed with her steps, and with each step she felt a little less heavy, a little less small. As she walked, she remembered. She remembered being 6 years old, building pillow forts alone while Morty played with toys Rick had given him. She remembered trying to join conversations that sped too fast for her to follow. She remembered the first time she felt invisible and how the feeling had followed her for years like a shadow she couldn't outrun. The lantern flickered, and for a moment she feared it might go out. She crouched, shielding it with her hands. The flame steadied, and she exhaled in relief. "Guess you're stubborn too," she whispered to it. There was comfort in that. A flame didn't need to be the brightest to matter, it just had to keep going. Summer sat in the grass, lantern beside her. The glow caught in her eyes, painting them gold. She thought of Morty, curled up in his room, humming the family's forgotten lullaby. She thought of Rick, sitting alone with his glass of water, pretending not to ache. She thought of her parents, trying and failing and trying again. And she realized something. Every one of them carried a kind of light. Morty's was soft and trembling, Rick's was sharp and flickering, Beth's and Jerry's came and went like fireflies. None of them filled the whole house, none of them erased the shadows, but together they were enough to keep the dark from swallowing everything. Her throat tightened, though she wasn't sad. She reached for the lantern again and held it close, its warmth pressed against her chest. When she finally stood, she whispered to the night, "I see you. And I see me too." She carried the lantern back home slowly, step by step, the way one carries a secret they're not ready to share, but never want to lose. By the time she slipped inside, the flame had dimmed, but it was still alive. Summer placed it on her bedside table, watching its glow ripple against the walls. She lay down, her body sinking into the mattress, her eyes heavy. The lantern kept burning as she drifted into sleep, guarding her dreams. And in some quiet corner of the house, where no one else could see, the light reached just far enough to touch another light, and another, until the whole family seemed held together by small flames they didn't even know they carried. Beth often noticed the chair. It wasn't special at first glance, just an ordinary wooden chair tucked into the corner of the dining room, its paint chipped, its legs uneven. Most nights no one sat there. And yet she felt its presence as though it were another member of the family, silent and waiting. When she was a child, Beth remembered her father leaving spaces like that: empty chairs, half-cleared tables, tools abandoned in the garage. He was always somewhere else, chasing stars, forgetting that she was down here, waiting. That empty chair became, in her memory, a kind of symbol, a reminder of what it meant to hope someone might stay, even if they didn't. Now, as an adult, she found herself staring at that same emptiness. Rick was in the garage, Morty lost in his restless dreams, Summer tucked away in her glowing quiet. Jerry fussed in the kitchen, humming nervously as he cleaned dishes that didn't need cleaning. Beth sat at the table, wine untouched, her eyes drawn again and again to that chair. It ached inside her, not sharply, but slowly, the way a river wears down stone. She remembered birthdays with an empty seat, holidays where laughter filled the room but always circled around something missing. She remembered the sound of her own voice, too often unheard. Tonight, though, she didn't turn away. She whispered to the chair as though it could listen. "You've been here longer than I have. You've seen all of us trying, failing, trying again. You've watched us grow and break and keep living anyway." Her words felt strange, but gentle. She leaned back, letting silence answer. After a while, Jerry came in, drying his hands on a towel. He noticed her gaze. "You're looking at it again?" he said, softly, almost shyly. Beth smiled faintly. "It's ridiculous, isn't it? Talking to a chair." Jerry shook his head. "Not ridiculous. Chairs remember things too, you know. They remember who sat there and who didn't." She blinked at him, startled by the unexpected tenderness in his voice. For once, he didn't try to make a joke, didn't try to fill the quiet. He just stood beside her, both of them facing the empty space together. Beth reached out then, resting her hand on the worn wood of the chair's back. It was cool under her touch, and she imagined the echoes it carried, the weight of her as a girl, climbing it to reach the counter, the weight of strangers, visitors, neighbors, long forgotten, the weight of no one at all through years when it simply stood watch. "I used to think it meant something was missing," she murmured. "But maybe it's just here to remind me there's still room. For anyone. For change. For forgiveness." Jerry placed his hand over hers, awkward but steady. "For us too?" Beth looked at him then, really looked, and her chest softened. "For us too." The house was quiet except for the ticking of a clock. Beth closed her eyes, letting the sound rock her like a heartbeat. She felt the chair's presence, not accusing, not empty, but open. A space not of loss, but of possibility. Later, when she went to bed, she left the chair where it was, untouched. It didn't need to be filled. Its silence was part of the family now, like a gentle pause in a lullaby. And as Beth drifted into sleep, she carried with her a quiet peace. That absence, too, could hold love. Jerry had never thought much about victories, not the kind you hear about in stories, with drums and cheers and fireworks. His victories were small, quiet things, making a breakfast without burning it, finishing a crossword, keeping a promise he'd almost forgotten. Most nights he let them slip by without notice, too busy worrying over everything that could go wrong. But tonight was different. It began simply with a glass of lemonade. He had poured it himself, shaking slightly as he filled it just below the rim. Summer passed by, her lantern already dimmed from her evening walk, and gave him a small, approving nod. Morty was asleep, tucked under his blankets with the faint hum of his dreams brushing the walls. Beth was in the kitchen washing dishes with a soft rhythm that made the room feel warm, even in its quiet. Jerry held the glass, feeling the cold touch of the condensation. And then he did something he rarely did. He smiled at it. Not a big smile, not a triumphant smile, but a real one, gentle and slow. He carried the glass into the living room, where Rick's gadgets hummed faintly in the shadows. He placed it carefully on the side table next to the couch, just where it would catch the lamp's soft glow. And then he sat down. It wasn't a victory that mattered to anyone else. No one noticed, no one applauded, but Jerry felt it fully. He had done something simple, and it was enough. Enough to feel capable. Enough to feel like he belonged, like he mattered in the small orbit of his family. For years, Jerry had chased approval, sought it in loud ways, in reckless attempts to impress. And for years, he had failed, loudly, embarrassingly, painfully. But now, in this quiet evening, he understood something he hadn't before. The quiet victories mattered more. They were the ones that built a life, that kept a house from falling apart in silence, that let love persist in small, unnoticed ways. He remembered a time when Rick had told him, "You'll never be enough, Jerry. You'll never measure up." And he had believed it, carried it like a shadow that grew heavier with each year. But now, in the calm of the house, he realized Rick was wrong. Or maybe he wasn't. Maybe Jerry didn't need to be enough by anyone's measure but his own. Jerry's victory tonight was this. He had made something right just for himself, and let it exist. He had held a moment of care, of intention, and it had not crumbled. He leaned back into the couch, letting the cushions hug him. The glass of lemonade glimmered faintly beside him, a tiny beacon in the soft light. He closed his eyes, listening to the gentle hum of the house, the slow tick of the clock, the quiet drip of water in the kitchen sink, the distant rustle of leaves brushing against the window. He thought of his family, of all the ways they struggled and loved, sometimes clumsily, sometimes silently. And he realized that his quiet victory was connected to theirs. Every small act of care, every quiet attempt at goodness was part of the same invisible web. And for once, Jerry felt that he had added something meaningful to it. Later, when he went to bed, he carried that sense of calm with him. It wrapped around his chest like a soft blanket, a warmth that didn't need words. And in the darkness, he smiled again, slower this time, letting the feeling settle deep inside. The universe outside might still be chaotic. Rick might still be reckless. Morty might still worry. Summer might still wander with her lantern. But Jerry had his victory, quiet, small, and entirely his own. And somewhere in that quiet, fragile triumph, he understood. Victories don't need to be loud, they only need to exist. Morty had always wondered where dreams went, not just the ones he remembered in the morning, but the ones that slipped away in the quiet dark, leaving only a soft echo behind. Tonight, as he lay under his blankets, he felt the familiar pull, a gentle tug as if a quiet hand were guiding him somewhere he didn't yet understand. He closed his eyes and the room began to soften. The edges of his bed melted into warm clouds, the ceiling stretched upward into the twilight sky. He was no longer in his room, yet he felt safe. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and rain, and somewhere far away a soft lullaby hummed, neither words nor tune, just a feeling that made him breathe slower. In the distance, he saw it, a bridge. Not a bridge of stone or wood, but one of light, suspended over a calm, endless ocean. The light pulsed gently, like it had a heartbeat. Morty felt a nervous flutter in his chest, the old familiar question whispering, "What if I fall?" And yet he stepped forward. With each step, The bridge seemed to respond, bending and glimmering beneath his feet. He thought of all the times he had doubted himself, stumbled through adventures, made mistakes that seemed too big to fix. But the bridge didn't judge. It simply held him, guiding him, waiting patiently. As he walked, shadows moved beneath the light, forms he recognized, soft echoes of fears he had carried for years. The fear of letting Rick down, the fear of Summer thinking he was too small, the fear of failing himself. But Morty didn't run from them. Instead, he watched, curious and calm. The shadows didn't roar or reach for him. They drifted like smoke in the wind, teaching him without words that fears weren't enemies. They were reminders of how much he cared, how much he had survived. With each careful step, Morty felt his chest lighten. His worries didn't disappear, but they no longer weighed him down. Halfway across the bridge, a soft voice called his name. Not loud, not startling, just gentle, warm. "Morty!" He turned to see a small figure on the bridge behind him, glowing faintly. It was himself, or a version of himself he had almost forgotten, confident, gentle, steady. It smiled, and Morty realized it had been waiting, quietly, for him to catch up. "You're okay," the figure said. "You've been doing your best all along." Morty felt tears prick his eyes, not of sadness, but of relief. He had been carrying so much, trying to measure himself against impossible standards, and here, on this bridge, he finally understood. He was enough. He had been enough, even in moments when he doubted it. The two Mortys walked together, the bridge glowing brighter under their steps. Stars appeared above, reflected in the calm water below, each one flickering like a whispered memory. And as they moved forward, the bridge began to curve upward, leading to a place of quiet warmth, a horizon that promised rest. When Morty finally opened his eyes, he was back in his bed. The night was still, the moon casting a soft glow through the window. But something inside him had changed. The bridge remained in his mind, a gentle reminder that even in darkness there was a path. Even in fear there was guidance. He smiled softly, curling under the blankets. The hum of the lullaby lingered in his ears, quiet and unhurried. And as sleep returned, Morty felt a rare peace, that he could step forward even when unsure and still be held by something kind, steady and patient. And somewhere beyond dreams, the bridge waited, glowing quietly, ready for him again. Rick had always been a wanderer. Not the kind who simply travels from place to place, but the kind whose mind and heart drifted through galaxies, timelines and possibilities. Yet tonight, even he felt a rare quiet settle over him, a gentle hush that softened the edges of the universe. He stood at the edge of a cliff made of starlight, looking down at a swirling nebula below. It glowed softly, colors shifting like liquid dreams. Normally, Rick would have tinkered with it, dissected it, poked at the physics until it bled into something new. But tonight, he didn't touch a thing. He just watched. There was a star in the distance, small but steady, its light flickering as if it knew something he didn't. He had traveled past countless suns, watched worlds rise and crumble, yet this one held a peculiar warmth. It reminded him, strangely, of home, not the place, but the feeling, the rare, fleeting warmth of connection, of quiet understanding. Rick sat down, his legs dangling over the edge. He let the hum of the cosmos enter him, a soft vibration that wasn't demanding, wasn't chaotic, just patient. For the first time in many cycles, he allowed himself to feel the weight of his choices, the lives he had touched, the people he had unintentionally loved. Memories drifted through his mind, Jerry's small victories, Morty's courage, Summer's quiet determination, Beth's unspoken understanding. They were fragile, fleeting, imperfect, but they existed. And in that existence, Rick found a strange comfort. He thought of the countless moments he had tried to outrun time, to escape consequences, to control the uncontrollable. And now, on this cliff of starlight, he realized some things didn't need to be fixed. Some things only needed to be observed, cherished quietly, and allowed to unfold in their own rhythm. The star pulsed again, and Rick whispered softly, almost to himself, "You're not mine, but you're here." And that's enough. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, ordinary object, a trinket he had carried across dimensions for reasons he barely remembered. He placed it carefully on the edge of the cliff, letting it catch the starlight. Perhaps it would stay there forever, perhaps it would drift away. He didn't care. It was a small act of letting go, and in letting go he felt lighter than he had in centuries. The wind, or something like it, a gentle cosmic current, brushed his face. Rick closed his eyes, letting it wash over him, carrying with it the quiet murmur of the universe. There were no explosions, no dramatic battles, no impossible inventions. Just the soft hum of existence, the slow pulse of life and love, and the stars that waited patiently for all of them to find their own way. He thought about the paths ahead, the choices he would still make, the mistakes he might never fix. And he smiled faintly, not with pride, but with acceptance. Everything he had been chasing, everything he had been running from, it had brought him here. And here was enough. Rick stretched out on the cliff, letting the starlight cradle him like a blanket. The nebula below shimmered, the distant star pulsed, and for the first time he didn't feel alone. He felt connected, not to any one planet or any single life, but to the gentle thread that tied all things together, the quiet persistence of care, the small acts of courage, the tender victories that no one noticed but themselves. And as sleep began to pull at his consciousness, Rick whispered into the vast, waiting universe. And with that, I'll let it be. I'll let it all be. Somewhere, a star flickered back in acknowledgement, and Rick allowed himself one last, slow breath. The universe was immense, chaotic, and beautiful, and he had found a quiet corner of it where he could finally rest.